My mother died in childbirth, and my grandmother actually turned my mother's body into a mummy and used my mother's soul to cultivate a resentment spirit. Everyone in the village said that Grandma was inhuman. Faced with the gossip in the village, she never explained, but she was preparing something alone in the bamboo house. Just after I was born, my stomach was covered with colorful worms, and they were still squirming. Grandma looked at me with horror on her face. It was actually a curse of being riddled with grain and being born with a short life. Grandma hurriedly lit an incense stick, sprinkled a handful of white glutinous rice on the black dog, and read a spell devoutly. Then a golden light fell on my heavenly spirit. Only then did I dig up and cried out loudly. Afterwards, my grandmother found a square sergeant, locked my mother in the bamboo house with special peach nails and corpse suppression talisman, and severely warned me not to approach. Just before I was 6, Grandma went out to see a doctor, and a person with red eyes and snake scales touched my forehead. I looked at her with horror on my face. When she saw me wake up, she turned around and walked out of the room with a dark smile on her face. At this moment, my grandmother was sitting on a stretcher and was carried back. Her right leg was revealed with white bones as if she had been bitten by some tiny insect, and her whole body was covered in blood. Grandma was not afraid, but also asked with an anxious face, "Have I been here?" I told my grandmother about the snake spirit monster. After thinking about it for a long time, she decided to teach me supplementary medical skills. She also set 3 rules for me. First, I don't treat ghosts. Second, I should treat shell. Third, I should treat do-good people. I learned from my grandmother. A few days later, 2 strong men anxiously attacked my house, saying that her pregnant daughter-in-law had an accident and her whole body was emitting a dead body. Grandma opened the pregnant woman's eyes and found a black, bloodshot beating constantly. This was actually a corpse insect filled with goo poison. Grandma immediately lit 7 bull lanterns, one of them around the pregnant woman according to the pattern of the Big Dipper, and at the same time pasted a yellow talisman paper on the pregnant woman's forehead. Suddenly a cloud of black gas drifted out of the pregnant woman, and one of the oil lamps ran away. My grandmother and I quickly followed up and told the strong man to keep an eye on the 7 lamps in the house, to let them go out and to follow us after dawn. Footprints come here before. I found an abandoned temple with my grandmother on my back. My grandmother actually said that this was a washing garden specially dedicated to dead bodies, and there was a decaying corpse inside. Then Grandma lit 3 rolling boxes, hoping that the ghost would accept the prince's hat of forgiving pregnant women. Unexpectedly, one of the food fragrances suddenly went out. At the same time, the stench of a dead man. Grandma looked serious, put on python gloves, and told me not to touch anything. When we walked to the northeast of the inn, a terrifying scene. A walking dead wrapped in white cloth stood in front of his body, exuded a dark black, evil aura, his stomach stretched out. Grandma's face changed drastically. This was actually a pregnant mother and son. When the fetus died in the bed before it was taken out, they became a walking dead together. They were extremely resentful, and they couldn't see a pregnant living person. Grandma asked me to touch the 4th Red Army besides Miss, and I was careful throughout the process to avoid touching the female corpse. At the moment I took off the Red 10th Army, the closed eyes of the female corpse suddenly opened. Eyes heavy with silent resentment and despair glared at me. Suddenly, my dark energy turned erratic, and the talisman affixed to my forehead flew off. I noticed the female corpse's mouth was sewn with thick hemp thread, seemingly to silence her eternally. Without hesitation, my grandmother and I fled the old temple. Glancing back, I witnessed the female corpse rest a hand on her belly, hopping in the hall, with eyes that seemed to implore for her unborn child's rescue. An elder from Qingshan stood at the temple's east entrance, a green sack around his waist. My grandmother murmured that he dealt with the dead, his gaze emitting a faint green gleam. Swept over me, and in a frosty tone he called me a Grudai. An uneasiness settled over me. This elder for no signs of life's essence. He was indeed a spirit handling corpses. Soon a throng of villagers converged, and the elder, with a wicked chakra, seized control of the female corpse, driving her out. Today's festivities brought no delight to my grandmother, for the gasping thickened and fixed its stare on us. She briefed the villages about pork strike. The inns expected Martha's land having encountered beyond death, and she advised them to clear the nearby woods on next spring, to banish the malign air with sunlight. My grandmother employed Red Lion's name as a remedy for the pregnant ladies awake. The lady whispered of a shadow in her dream, mouth-stitched, draped in white, unable to deliver a thing. Dream visions of vibrant lady thought to appear later. We remembered with the villagers. My grandmother blended Cinnabon with canine blood for protective angelists, urging the expected woman to adorn herself until her child's birth. A visit to the maternity ward was essential. Clear to me, this was protection against the corpse strike. The villagers recounted tales of a former milk use a corpse strike during what walked out from trip to Poison Mountain. My grandmother's complexion went ghostly. The corpse driver's poison insects hail from that mountain, akin to those affecting her mother. Distressed, she escorted me towards home, but agonizing pricks surging in my belly made me hemorrhage. A pentagon mark etching into my flesh. My grandmother hastily placed a peachwood segment in my mouth. Retrieving the iron box I carried, her face drained of color. She cried out at the dew ailment flaring within me. Darkness overtook me, rousing. I was back at the bamboo shelter housing my mother's remains, yearning to enter but retreating in reflex. My lifelong ban from the space echoed in my mind. I held my grandmother, her response too late, before committing my entry inside an open square casket. My grandmother, tear-stripping and seated, regretfully disclosed that my mother's body had vanished, her spirit adamant against burial for years. It turns out it was to suppress the 5 goo insects within me. Grandma told me that after my mother left, the goo insects in me would keep acting up, tormenting me until my death, and Grandma had no cure for it. As the villagers' curses rang from outside, calling to drive me and Grandma out, she remained unmoved, even calmly telling me to pack up and leave the village. Just as we set out, a wail came from the mountain village, and a certain gleam flickered in Grandma's eyes.